All right, continuing in the Ezra and Esther class, and we're looking at Esther now, the book of Esther. Remember, we looked at the first part of the book of Ezra. We will continue with the rest of Ezra after we finish the book of Esther, because that fits the chronology of events. First 6 chapters of Ezra, then book of Esther, and then continues back in chapter 7 of Ezra. After Ezra actually is born. Ezra is not alive during these time periods that we're looking at right here. And so Esther, we talked about her humbleness as a woman who loved the Lord, who was very humble in her approach in life. And I believe I talked about this last time in this class, that there are different personalities found in the Bible that we may match your personality. You might be a person that's very humble and fear that you can't really serve God because you don't have what we used to call gumption. I don't know if that's a real word or not, but the fortitude, whatever, to speak out, and how sometimes we don't feel like we can do that. Well, that's the way that Esther was, and yet God did give her the courage to speak up, and by that courage helped deliver Israel from this attempted Holocaust that was about to happen to them. If you remember the beauty contest that Vashti, the queen, refused to parade herself before the king's men, and they were afraid that if she gets away with it, then their wives will get away with it. And you see, just hear the wimpiness of these men here, how that we have to keep our women under subjection, or we're going to they can take over us at any time kind of attitude, which is obviously very foolish of them. But we're talking about people that are not serving the Lord in any capacity at all, and life shouldn't be like this. But it was, and so nevertheless, because of her refusal, she's being banished now, and so the king decides he's going to put on a beauty contest and get him another queen. And so he does this, and we see here, it's a long process. Verse 12, verse 11, it says, Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. I think Mordecai felt like this was an opportunity for Esther to be taken care of, to live a peaceful life, what have you. And he didn't realize the outcome of this. And I think he in his mind, he was looking out for Esther. But nevertheless, she was involved in this. Whether this was right or wrong is hard to say. Is this wrong for Esther to go through this process? Well, maybe it was. I don't know. It's a difficult situation to see, because we don't really know exactly all the events that took place. However, you read the text, it does say, now when every maid's turn was come to go to the king, Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with sweet odors, with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given to her, to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and the morrow she returned unto the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came into the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she was called by name. So really, all the women here appears, they go from the house of virgins into the king's house, and in a sense becomes another wife. We talk about Solomon and his 700 wives, and of course that's a ridiculous number, but what we sometimes fail to see is that not all his wives were necessarily women that he had been with. Maybe some were, maybe some weren't, but what could happen is one of his wives could have had sisters, and his their parents died, and Solomon took them in as his wives to give them protection because, just in a sense to help them out. Now, polygamy is never right, and the Bible never promotes polygamy, although we know David did, and Saul did, and Solomon, yes, obviously did, and other kings did as well. But just because something happened doesn't mean that God ordained it to happen. It was God's desire, and it is God's desire for marriage between a man and a woman. That's what the scriptures teach us. And so, because these other things took place, it doesn't justify them. A lot of things happen and they're not right. Can God use a person who is committing one of these sins? Absolutely. God can use an unsaved person. Can this person find favor with the Lord? Yes, they can. Now, I'm not saying it's right, and I'm not saying we can go out there and sin and get away with it, that God's going to look it over. I'm just telling you that there's events in the Bible that took place. David was a man after God's own heart. The Bible tells us that. Did he have multiple wives? Yes, he did. Was it right? No, it wasn't. And that's all I can say to that. I can say that God used David, and God will continue to use David in the millennial kingdom. But God did not overlook his sin. God would chasten him for that. But we may get to heaven and realize that we've been doing a whole lot of things outside the Scripture that we didn't even think was sin. And I think many of these people in this day and time did things that they didn't feel was wrong because other nations were doing them. And when they get to heaven, find out that they were wrong in what they were doing. But remember, whatever is not of faith is sin, the Scriptures tell us. So make sure you base your life upon the Word, not upon what other people do. And that's a very, very important thing to understand, is that I don't base my Christian life over the people that are around me. I don't base my Christian life upon a pastor or a missionary or whomever. I base my life upon Jesus Christ. That way, if man fails me, I still serve God. And you see these people who get out of church because a pastor failed them. Well, they were looking at the pastor the whole time and not God anyway. And so people use that as an excuse. Well, I don't go to church because this pastor did such and such. Well, then your hope was in them and not in the Lord. But it goes on to say here, verse 14, in the evening she went on the morrow, she returned in the second house of the women to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. And then verse 15. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, this uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come into the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And so you see the humility of her. Verse 17, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so now Esther here ends up being queen, and this is actually about 4 years after Vashti left. And so there's a lot takes place here. This is not a quick situation at all between Vashti and Esther. The days of the purification and all these different things take place as well. So what's going on with Ahasuerus and the people at this time, and why this party, this long party took place, and all the events here. To understand it, I think we kind of need to look at the history of what's going on at this point. Back in the spring of 480, Ahasuerus led his people who crossed over the Dardanelles with 100,000 men and 100 ships. So a huge army takes place here. He ends up losing 400 of the ships in a storm. Hundreds of ships, not 100 ships, but hundreds of ships I think I might have read that wrong, so just to clarify that if I did. But ended up losing 400 in a storm. History tells us that in anger he beat upon the waters with his belt. That I'm king, I'm in control. Even the waters should obey me in that sense. Well, his troops end up stopping at Thermopylae, in what's known as the Battle of Thermopylae, and then later on they would move to Salamis. But a large portion, again, of his army, if you look to the right, the Persian army were wrecked by the storm. And so, this is a long trip that he took in this battle. He ended up burning Athens to the ground. Some escaped to the island here, but he did have this victory. But those who escaped to Salamis, obviously far less. But Ahasuerus was very confident that if I can defeat Athens, I can surely defeat Salamis. And in fact, he outnumbered them 3-1. So, this was a very simple battle that he thought that he would win. Well, end up that the Greeks that he was fighting against had smaller boats, swifter, faster boats, and they actually had mastered the art of ramming other boats. Remember, they didn't have the weapons that we have today, so the ship battles were battles that were very close to each other, not shooting missiles across the waters at each other. Well, Ahasuerus ended up getting defeated by these smaller boats. His remaining troops were led by one of his generals named Mardonius. A year later, Mardonius ends up being defeated and killed in 479 BC at Plateau. And so you see everything just starting to destruct around Ahasuerus. Well, in Esther, it says, so it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maids were gathered together unto Shushan. Actually, I've already read through this. That's the wrong screen here. But nevertheless, that's the events that's taking place. The reason for the party was to build up patriotism among the people. Even though he suffered a great defeat, he wanted to prove to the people that he was still happy and content, and maybe even lying to people, telling them that the battle wasn't as bad as everybody thought that it was. And yes, we did have victory, even though we lost a lot of men. Who knows what all he did, but this is exactly what politicians do. They cover everything up to make themselves look better. And so we have the events here again with the party. Now, chapter 2, very interesting story here. And this is such a great story because it tells us that God does care and God does know what we're going through, and God knows when to answer our prayers. God knows when to reward us. Maybe you've been praying for something for a long time and God hasn't given it to you. It may be just around the corner. God knows when you can handle what it is that you're praying for, and God does care about us. Mordecai, remember, he would go before to Esther on a regular occasion to find out how she's doing. He went to the gate of the city, and there at the gate of the city, he overheard a conversation and a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus. Mordecai knew the right thing to do was to honor the king, and so he goes to Esther, tells Esther exactly what happened. I'm summarizing this, very quickly here, but the guards here were executed, and it was written down and recorded in the book of history of the king, not First Kings, Second Kings, like in our Bible, but the king Ahasuerus. So in his records, that's all was recorded. Later in 465, Ahasuerus would be assassinated in a similar plot as this. But nevertheless, at this time, Mordecai overhears these two men, Bigthan and Teresh, talking about their plot to overtake the king. And he knows the right thing to do is to let the king know that what's going on here. Well, when the king hears this, he takes care of Bigthan and Teresh, but he doesn't do anything for Mordecai. And there's nothing in the scriptures that indicate that Mordecai was upset about this. He simply did the right thing without reward. It's not what he was seeking after. So, it gives us a lesson of life as well, that when we do the right thing, we don't necessarily look to be rewarded for it. We do the right thing, and if you're rewarded for it, praise God. If you're not, you praise God, knowing that God knows what's best. And it may be that your reward comes down the road. And of course, this what takes place here, and then what an amazing turn of events that takes place here, that when Mordecai is rewarded. Well, Haman ends up, who is an Agagite, an Amalekite, but specifically not just an Amalekite, but an Agagite. Why does that matter? Well, King Agag was the king of the Amalekites during the time of Saul, when Saul was king over Israel. And Saul was ordered by God to defeat the Amalekites and to wipe them out. Israel had constant problems with the Amalekites over the years. The Amalekites tried to wipe out the Israelites. And so just that struggle back and forth. And now the time came when God was going to end the Amalekites. So Saul went into battle. In the battle, though, they end up capturing the king and animals and other people. Well, Samuel comes to confront Saul about the situation. As he does, he hears the sheep in the background, and he asks the question. The King James, it says, "What means this bleating of the sheep? Or why do I hear sheep?" And Saul said, "Well, I kept back these sheep so I can offer them as sacrifices to God." And Samuel said, "That's not really what God told you to do, was it?" And then come to find out that Saul kept Agag alive, the king alive. Well, Samuel does end up executing the king as God commanded him because of his wickedness. But obviously, Saul failed in destroying all the Amalekites. Because Haman was a survivor, or his ancestors were a survivor. I believe this may have been what motivated Haman during this situation here between him and the Jews. The reason he hated the Jews is because he knew what the Jews had done to his ancestors. And so, and to one of his great-great-great-grandfather, however many back it was that King Agag was, because he was directly descended from him. And so this played into the role of the book of Esther. And if Saul had did the job that God called him to do, we wouldn't have the book of Esther. Well, Haman, even though he's an Amalekite, he rises up in ranks in the Persian kingdom like Daniel did and others did. Daniel was not unique in his rise to power. He wasn't just believers who rose to great power, but unbelievers as well. Haman. In 1 Samuel 15, this passage I was talking about, and Israel and the Amalekites had been enemies for quite a while. In fact, even before the Jews went into the Promised Land, the Amalekites had attacked Israel in the wilderness. We see that in Exodus chapter 17, or Deuteronomy chapter 25. We also see the pride of the Amalekites, and that's what led to their defeat. That should have been their defeat completely in the days of Saul. It says, the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. So God, even back in Exodus, says the Amalekites' days are numbered. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way when you were come forth out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way, smote the hindmost of thee, even all that was feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in a land which the Lord thy God gives thee for inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it. Don't forget, God says, that one day I'm going to let you make everybody else forget Amalek. After you're settled in land, after everything goes, you get situated as a nation. This will happen. Of course, that happened, and then when Saul became king. Well, Haman here was a very prideful man, as I said, and his pride is seen in that he expected, because of his rise to power, that everybody obey him, everybody to bow down before him. Well, Mordecai was not a person to bow down before man. He would bow down before God, but he would not bow down before man. And so Haman was angered over this. In chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. For they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. And so what Haman didn't realize is that Esther was related to Mordecai. But nevertheless, he found out they were Jews, and so he was going to lay hands on Mordecai alone, but come to find out Mordecai's a Jew, so hey, let's get all of them. Let's kill all the Jews in all the land, because this one didn't bow down before me. And so he devised a lie. And he knew the law of the land. The law of the land is that if there is a law made, then that law has to stand and nobody can change the law. Remember when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den? The king didn't want that to happen. When he found out that it was Daniel that prayed, then the king was upset over that. And the king, in fact, he stayed up all night, it says, and fasted and prayed for Daniel. Not that the king was saved, but he really did care for Daniel. He liked Daniel and knew that Daniel was a good man, but the law was made, the laws of the Medes and Persians. Haman says unto King Ahasuerus, he said, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. So, king, in the past, we've captured these people, and they're throughout all of our land, and these people are not for you at all, king. He said their laws are different from other people's laws. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it's not for the king's profit to suffer them or to allow them to live. So, in other words, king, you need to get rid of these people. They're all against you. They're plotting against you. And the king takes Haman at his word. Didn't realize that Haman was plot here, but took him at his word. Haman just even wants to participate in this and say, well, I'll even give money to take care of this and take care of the Jews. I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver, knowing that as a government official, he probably was corrupt and could get whatever he wanted back. And so his thought was, too, that if I kill all the Jews, everything they have is left behind. So, hey, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasury. Of course, it also says that he'll pay it to those who have charge of the business, and who was in charge, Haman was. So this may have been very shrewd attempt here to say I'll give money to myself. The king agreed, and also told Haman, "Don't worry about it. You don't have to pay anything for this. You're saving my life. You're protecting me." Kind of like Mordecai did with Bigthan Teresh. The king was happy that his life was saved. So, Haman, if you're warning me and these people truly are against me, then hey, you're a hero to me. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, "The silver is given to thee, the people also to do with thee as it seems good to thee." So take whatever men you need, whatever finance you need, you're in charge. Well, they made an edict on a certain day in the last month of the year. All these people could be killed, executed. And so they sat down and relaxed over a drink in chapter 3, verse 15. The edict is put into place under the laws of Medes and Persians. And under the laws of Medes and Persians, there's nothing that could be done to stop this. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Now, because the Jews who lived there were good people. The capital city, Shushan, they're wondering why. Why do we kill all of these Jews? But nevertheless, once the edict is declared, nothing could stop it. Well, Mordecai's response to Haman's plot is a very proper response. Mordecai knew there's nothing he could do. And so what he decided to do was go to the queen, get the queen to do whatever she could do. Mordecai's upset, and so he does make his way to Esther. He goes into deep mourning over this. And because he's in deep mourning, a person that's in mourning like this is not allowed to go into the palace area. Esther here didn't realize what was going on. She wasn't informed. Yes, she was a queen, but remember, unless she was called before the king, she really did not know what was going on. So Mordecai does end up telling her and advising her that she needs to go to the king immediately. This is not an easy thing to do. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth with ashes, went out to the midst of the city, and cried with a louder and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The people knew the law was in place. And so they did go to the Lord in fasting, in the Great Depression, and sackcloth and ashes, weeping and wailing. I mean, this obviously was a very sad moment for the Jews there in Persia at this time. Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and some money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasurer to the Jews to destroy them. gave him the copy of the writings for the decree that was given at Shushan, the palace, to destroy them, to show it to Esther. Remember, Mordecai himself couldn't go because he was in mourning. So he sent someone with a letter to give to Esther. Well, Haytok, the man's name, came and he told Esther of all these different events that was going to take place. Esther, though, remember, kind of very humble woman, maybe somewhat shy in her demeanor, and not one to challenge authority. First instinct was that I can't take it to the king. Unless I'm summoned before the king, I could be put to death simply for entering into his presence. And so, very big dilemma for her. She knew the consequences going in, but she also knew the importance of going in. And so, very importantly, she does this. And Mordecai says this to her. Mordecai command to Esther, because Esther says, if I go to the king, he's going to kill me. And Mordecai says, wait a minute, Esther, think about this. The reason you're in the position that you're in today could very well be because God put you in this position. Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Right? Esther, what's going to happen to you? You can be put to death. So if you go in the king and he kills you, down the line, it doesn't really matter, does it? For thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time. And this is really a very important statement here. Because, sometimes theologians, preachers will say that if Esther didn't go before the king, then all the Jews would have been wiped out. And that would have been the end of it. So Esther single-handedly saved the nation of Israel. No. And Mordecai understood that's not true either. First of all, there were still Jews back in the land of Israel. Then you had the Jews from the northern kingdom that were taken into captivity in 721. And so there were other Jews in the world at this time. And Mordecai even states this. He says, Esther, if you hold your peace, then what's going to happen? Well, then God will deliver us some other way. All right, that's exactly what's going to happen. God will deliver his people some other way, but not all his people. There will be those who die. And Esther, what you need to understand is what's going to happen to you and what's going to happen to us, to me and you. So he said, if thou hold your peace, then God's going to deliver us. He's going to deliver the Jews from some other place. But thou and thy father's house, which means you and me, those around us, will be destroyed. And then very importantly, the statement says, and who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther, you're queen because God put you there. As God appoints all royalty, all leaders. So if God puts you there at this time, it may be to save the Jews that are here in Persia. But if you don't do it, then God will deliver the other Jews somehow. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? God can deliver us, but if not, that's okay too. Well, God had already promised the Israelites and the world of the Jews' survival. And so Abrahamic covenant was given in Genesis 12, ratified in Genesis 15, carried on throughout the Bible, reminded in Jeremiah 31 that God has a future for Israel, reminded again in the book of Hebrews, other places as well, Romans 9 through 11, but many places in the Bible that Israel has a future. And so no matter what, nobody is going to wipe out all the Jews. Hitler couldn't do it in World War II. Yes, he did murder millions of Jews, but could he wipe them out as a people? Nobody can do that. Just like Christianity today. Christianity will not be lost from this world. What was the guy's name? Voltaire, French philosopher, atheist, made the statement one day. He said that within 100 years, he said, of his life, that after 100 years, that Christianity would be no more remembered. Maybe not worded exactly like that, but he felt like that nobody would even know what a Christian was within 100 years. After his death, the house that he lived in ended up being a place where they would print out gospel tracts from that house. And while Voltaire might be somewhat remembered, he also made the statement that it would be impossible for man to travel over 25 miles an hour, that he would suffocate because of that, which of course was a stupid statement, very, very unscientific, but yet people held him as this great thinker, and come to find out his thoughts really didn't matter very much. So if altogether that hold us out peace at this time, then God will deliver us some other way. Maybe not me or you, but God will deliver the Jews. So he knew that the Abrahamic covenant said Israel had a future. Two different phrases, very important here, noteworthy. First of all, then shall deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. So, even though the name of God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, surely Mordecai knew that God would deliver. And also thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther's impact upon the Jews influenced her stepson, Artaxerxes, who later would be the one to help Ezra and Nehemiah. So, God did use Esther in a mighty way. It's Esther who influenced Ezra through her stepson. And then next week we'll look at the plight of Esther, the events that take place there because of this decree that was put out and how that it would be handled.